It's a pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Claudia Lehner-Jobst, back to the stage. As Wolfram mentioned earlier, she has participated in a number of exhibitions and publications that has led her to be a featured speaker in symposia that we've held here in recent years. Among these have been the Dupaquier exhibition, which has already been mentioned several times, the book Fired by Passion, Vienna Baroque Porcelain of Claudius Innocentius Dupaquier. She wrote an important essay in that catalog. She also contributed to Refinement and Elegance, early 19th century royal porcelain from the Twentieth collection, which was an exhibition from that collection was held here in 2007. She not only contributed to the catalog, but also was a speaker in a symposia here. She's done a number of exhibitions in her capacity as an art historian and independent curator living in Vienna for the Liechtenstein Museum. She worked on and helped to organize Baroque luxury porcelain, the manufactories of Dupaquier in Vienna and of Carlo Ginori in Florence, which took place in 2005. And currently, she has organized and helped to write the catalog for an exhibition of neoclassical porcelain from Croatia that's in the Liechtenstein Museum in Vienna. She studied at the University of Vienna and took her PhD dissertation on the Imperial Vienna porcelain manufactory during the neoclassical period. But one of her abiding interests has been the cultural aspects of history and art history, particularly of the Habsburg family and their palaces. And it is that aspect that she's going to focus on now in a lecture that is titled A Dinner Invitation to a Viennese Palace, Impressions of Neoclassical Interiors and Table Culture. Claudia.
Well, thank you, Ian, for the introduction, and thank you, Wolfram, for inviting me to speak today. And thank you for coming this afternoon. I would like to take you on a journey to Vienna around 1780, and I will start with showing you some of the most important palaces so that you know in which surrounding these dinners would take place. This is a map of Vienna of around 1780, and it shows you the center of Vienna. Well, that what is now the first district. Of course, Vienna spreads very wide nowadays, but what is now the first district was surrounded by city walls, and you had the Imperial Palace within, and the palaces of the most important noble families also within the city walls, which were very helpful to protect people and arts and treasures against the Turks. But no longer in the 1780s, the Turks were a threat. So as you can see, there are all the summer palaces around Vienna. You can see the wonderful gardens stretched out here, and many of these families who had their palaces within the city walls, many of the families who had their palaces within the city walls also built wonderful palaces outside of the city. And the ruling Empress, of course, Maria Theresa, and her son Joseph II are shown here in Vienna porcelain medallions. This is Maria Theresa and Joseph II, and these medallions are signed by Joseph Grassi, who was the master modeler of the Vienna manufactory at the time. They must date around 1775, and they are masterpieces in biscuit porcelain, and very rare to have these very fine flower frames around them. And these two pieces belong to the Esterhazy collection still today. And you can see these wonderful neoclassical gilt frames with the swags, and this is something which probably reminds you of the silver you have seen. Now that's a picture already familiar to you this afternoon, the coronation of Joseph II. You can see him sitting here next to his father, Francis Stephen of Lorraine. And as Wolfram explained before, around it you had the tables of the German sovereigns. And you might have noticed in the picture, which Wolfram showed, that there was no one sitting at these tables. So none of the German sovereigns came to that coronation. It was a sort of demonstration of their not being satisfied anymore with being ruled by the Holy Roman Emperor, so to speak. But still it was a great display of wealth and, of course, table ornament and table culture, and even food was always a great medium of showing wealth and the attitude of the ruling person, because, of course, it was very costly and it spoke to all the senses of the guests. And this picture is somewhat a symbol of the changing times. The ancien régime was about to fade. It wasn't very obvious yet, but behind the scenes, as you could see at this coronation, no one appeared. It was all show. And this centerpiece on the right also symbolizes this change. It's here displayed on that buffet in the center. It has been changed slightly later, but it has these porcelain flowers in the middle, and it's symbolizing this passing age. Here you can see how such surtouts or centerpieces were used, but no longer around 1780 when this service was made. But all that splendor was somehow exchanged for a more reasonable way of setting the table. Well, relatively reasonable. And here you can see, I show this as a contrast and also as a symbol for the changing times. It's the private chocolate pot of Joseph II. You can see his initials here. It's his private chocolate pot, and it's also made by Ignaz Josef Würth, the same master who made this splendid service for the Duke of Sachsen Teschen. And you can see how functional this piece of silver is compared to the big tureens. And it shows not only that, of course, behind the scenes one used functional objects, which were nevertheless precious because made of silver, but it also shows the personal taste of Joseph II, who, when he became emperor, was a very reasonable, almost sober person, and he introduced many useful but also many harsh reforms to Austria and to the Habsburg Empire. Here I show you just to get a sense of Vienna's court society, and this is made by Hieronymus Löschenkohl, who was somewhat a court chronicler or a Viennese city chronicler of the time, a visual chronicler. And here you have, he liked to show people in silhouettes, which was the fashion of the day. But this also symbolizes a reform, one of the reforms which Joseph II introduced. He opened many of the imperial gardens to the public, and this is a very interesting gesture because he somewhat allowed people to have pleasure and to participate in the processions of the court in their gardens. And this was a time of great change, of social and political change. It was the time of Enlightenment, which was also a very strong stream in Vienna. And here you can see Joseph II. This is also one of these reports by Löschenkohl, visual reports. It shows Joseph II in conversation with Papst Pius VI. And it's remarkable that the Pope came to Vienna especially to discuss with the Emperor the Emperor's idea of having a state church, which sounds very harsh too, but it was his way of escaping the control by the Pope, because he would then be the head of the church. And the Pope tried to discuss this, but in vain. And that's a New Year's feast in 1790. And you can see what one imagined court New Year's would look like, a civilized conversation, and the ladies in the latest fashion with their high hair, as you can see here. And this would be Joseph II talking to his future sister-in-law, and then Count Kaunitz, who was the protector of the Viennese Art Academy. And then here you have Prince of Liechtenstein. So all the important people would gather here, and sheets of engravings like this, colored engravings, would report to the public what was going on behind the doors in the palace. And as I said, the times of the very formal dinners and ceremonies were not really over yet, but court society and of course also other noble families were longing for a more relaxed, so not in our terms, but a loose and ceremonial at the time. And feasts like this one, it's a spring feast on a winter's day in the Orangerie in Schönbrunn, would give the opportunity of a more informal dining experience. And you can see these two parties here, and it's a very different impression than what we had from the coronation. So it would be just delighting people and the guests in, a greenhouse in the middle of winter. And Löschenkohl also produced fans which showed the latest events at court. And here is Emperor Leopold and his family on this fan. And Leopold succeeded Joseph II in 1790 when Joseph died. And just for 2 years, then he died himself, and Emperor Francis II ascended through the throne. But this fan shows you how, relatively relaxed the court showed itself to the public now. The children are in those play suits, as one might call them, and the emperor and his wife are in rather informal conversation in their garden. And also the dress has changed. There are these bonnets, and it's the French fashion, which was still the greatest fashion of the day. And this is from the Journal of Fashion in Vienna, and it's called a Viennese dress, with this particular headdress, which was very popular. And it was so popular that it also found its way as a decoration on Vienna porcelain. As you can see, there's a whole series of these coffee cups and saucers showing the latest headdress fashion. And there were also critics about this fashion. You might know about the incroyable, which appeared in France in the shadow of the French Revolution, all these fashion addicts. And the Viennese are never very extreme in their ways, but they somewhat adopted a little bit of this extreme addiction to fashion. And there is a publication of 1781. It's called Thoughts on the Fashion in Vienna. And a gentleman, anonymous gentleman, writes that the beautiful sex can be compared with a fertile soil, on which there is an orangery, and it's planted with all kinds of flowers. If you don't keep it under the scissors regularly, it will overgrow and get wild. So this was what people looked like, or how we can imagine people being dressed and people having conversations. And my main focus is porcelain, but I want to show you what the table decoration or tableware could look like. And as Wolfram already said, it was a time of transition. It was what we call the Josephinische Stil, the style under Joseph II. It's also called the Zopfstil in Germany, and it shows these heavy swags. That's, by the way, it's a wine cooler from the princely collection in Liechtenstein, and it shows the attempt of somewhat translating the language or the aesthetics of silver into porcelain, and it doesn't really work because it looks a bit heavy, and then with the glaze, it distracts from the modeling, and then you have the painting. It's all a little bit too much, but it's trying to translate the first neoclassical style into porcelain. And here are some details. That's a biscuit, it's unglazed porcelain relief, and there you have the ram. It's of course also influenced from French styles, but as I said, if you look at these details and compare it to what silverwork is able to do in terms of relief, it just cannot compare. So the porcelain manufactory, as also had the furniture manufacturers, they all had to find a new style, and refinement in a certain way was called for. That's another wine cooler, which will come up at the Dorotheum in Vienna for sale very soon, but it's interesting because it's from a Metternich service. And that's an oven, one of these wonderful ovens, or stoves, which heat the Viennese palaces during the harsh winters. And this one is in the Esterhazy Palace, but it also shows you this heaviness of the style of Joseph II. It was a time of great artistic and aesthetic change as well, and it was a very fertile time for the decorative arts because, as Wolfram mentioned, there was an academy for engravers, there was academy for manufactory workers. They all, thanks to Fürst Kaunitz, who was the protector of the academy, all the employees or the artists who worked for the luxury good manufacturers like the porcelain manufactory or the silver manufactories, they all had to go through an academic education from now on, and which was of course very helpful, and one didn't only think of getting them, to find their artistic fulfillment, but it was also a means of reducing the imports, especially from France, which were very expensive and which also took the money out of the country. So one did everything to improve the own manufactories, and Johann Hagenauer was the director of the Engravers Academy at the time. And here I show you two drawings which also symbolize this time of transition, because you have somewhat exaggerate, and here the rosettes and all these neoclassical ornaments which are exaggerated in a way. And then on the other hand, again, as you also see in the Silver Service, this wish for naturalistic forms which still came from the mid-18th century taste. But it was never really given up in Vienna, so this very strict abstraction was rarely fulfilled, which was neoclassical style, perhaps in France, for example. And Hagenauer also designed more rosettes, which you find on almost all the decorative arts at the time. And he was discriminated a little bit by his artist friends at first, but then, of course, the decorative arts got a new status within the arts because of the academic training of the artists. And here I show you two people you know already, Marie-Christine and Albert von Sachsen Teschen, on a painting also from the Martin van Muyten school of the mid-1770s. And here a porcelain depiction of the couple. Well, it's a tradition says that this is a depiction or a portrait of the two, and it's well possible. I mean, it was very popular to have porcelain portraits of the Imperial members. And this is a picture you've also seen already today. It's the dining room in the Schönenberg Palace in Brussels, and one of the tureens. And I think one can say that Marie-Christine and Albert von Sachsen Teschen, with their very refined taste, brought, when they had to come back to Vienna from the lowlands, they brought back a taste for the more refined French-influenced styles, and it had a very fruitful effect on the Viennese production of all kinds. That's the cupola in the Schönenberg Palace here. And something which needs to be mentioned is that Albert von Sachsen Teschen, like many of his contemporaries, was a member of a Freemasons' lodge in the lowlands, but also in Vienna then later on, and his Brussels palace and gardens. Here's the Temple of Friendship on the right. But also his palace in Vienna had many allusions to Masonic symbolism. That's the palace in Vienna, which you may perhaps all know as the Albertina, named after Albert and his collection. And I show you some of the interiors which were transformed after the Schönenberg model. And here is the Temple du Soleil, the Sun Temple in Brussels, and it had these wonderful panels, which I then show you here, inlaid with medallions made of Wedgwood porcelain. These wonderful reliefs on blue and white, and these panels depict the four elements. And I show you a porcelain set which somewhat follows the same idea or same stylistic ideas, and it has here, don't know if you can see it, it's blue and white. It's an allusion to the Wedgwood manners. And here is the portrait of Count Saurau, who as an ambassador gave this service to the British English ambassador in Vienna at the time. It's around 1790 and made in the Vienna porcelain manufactory. It's now owned by the Wien Museum, the Vienna Museum. And as you can see, porcelain has changed considerably by 1785 to 90. And I just show you a few associations. Here is a floor ornament. It's an inlaid floor from Albert von Sachsen Teschen's palace. And on the right you can see a cup and saucer made at the Vienna porcelain manufactory, and you can see the richness of the raised gilded ornament, which is still very much in the antiquities style, in the antique ornaments, which are now stylized and in a more playful way, and the wonderful colors which were used. And it somehow reminded me of this floor design. And the same here with a relief which was also taken from Brussels to Vienna with the fleeing couple. And I show you below a cup and saucer, also from the Vienna manufactory from around 1790. It's in the princely collection, Liechtenstein collection, and you can see some similarities in the taste for this rich raised gilding. And that's the ceiling of the golden room in the Albertina, and it's painted with putty by Heinrich Friedrich Füger, the great miniaturist and classicist in Vienna. He was also vice director of the Academy and a very famous figure in Viennese art at the time. And the gilding with flowers was something which was also translated into porcelain and found its way to the tables, the coffee and breakfast table in this case. And then another very fine floor from the Albertina and a cup and saucer, which might have gone there for breakfast. And again, from the palace of Albert and Marie Christine, and somewhat relics from their times in Brussels, is this French lock, door lock and knob, and a pair of stools, also from the Schönenberg Palace. And on the right is a wonderful, most exquisite plate from the Twilight collection, and it's with two-colored gold, raised gold, on a luster, on a brown copper luster ground, so it's splendor and light in this dessert plate. And then again from the bedroom of Archduke Charles, or Karl, Erzherzog Karl, who was the adopted son of Albert and Marie Christine. In his bedroom, in the Albertina, there are these panels and the window decoration, also with raised gilding on a white ground. And on the right, I show you a design from the porcelain manufactory, which shows a similar approach to ornament. And this is Archduke Karl. I just show him to you because he was also a very important man in the history of Austria in the late 18th century. As a very young man, at the age of 25, he became a celebrated hero in the wars of coalition. And it's a cup and saucer with his portrait in a private collection in Austria. And on the right, you can see a table sculpture commemorating his first great victory against the French troops. He chased them back behind the Rhine, and that was in 1796. And this is a figure of Germania, and this is Rhine, the river god, and that's of course the wreath for his victory. And the inscription says that Karl von Österreich, in his 25th year, was very courageous, and he rescued Austria from the enemy, and he's thanked by everyone. And it's a very interesting piece of porcelain. It's 39 centimeters in height, and it was a real table monument. And this is the Auersberg Palace. It's now in the 8th district in Vienna, but of course it was outside the city walls in a wonderful garden, and it was owned by the Prince of Auersberg, and he also was inspired by the new refined neoclassical style, which became to be the great fashion in Vienna. And this is the ballroom, and it was designed by Benedict Henrici, who was an architect, and we can really imagine him to be a star interior designer at the time. He worked for all the great families like the Liechtenstein, Esterhazy, and the Auersbergs. and he was handed around to create interiors. And this is one reason why there are similarities, but also proof for the great quality, as you can see, the relief. And it somehow reminds us of the interior at the Schönenborg Palace in Brussels with the reliefs. And you can see the scrolls which we find again on the silver work and the figural, wonderful reliefs in the taste of the antiquity. And the Prince of Auersperg was host to many of wonderful feasts, and here the King of Naples had come to Vienna in the early 1790s to marry off his daughters to two of the Austrian archdukes. So it was very much the habit at the time. And the Prince of Auersperg held a wonderful feast for the King of Naples. It also illustrates his high rank in court society. And there was a dinner set for 130 guests, and it was in winter. As you saw here, it's a sleigh ride organized, so it was in February. And here is one of the lackeys of the Prince of Auersperg bringing some sugar work to the table. It's a great document. And the Prince of Auersperg, he managed in the middle of winter to find flowers. So he impressed his guests after dinner with this illuminated winter garden, which was covered with local and foreign flowers and fruit. And then there was a concert in the Temple of Flora. And he was also a member of Masonic Lodge, so his garden was also filled with Masonic symbolism. He had all these temples as well, temples of humanity and temple of friendship, and here the Temple of Flora, where a concert took place, and it was illuminated with 1,000 lights, and people sat on stools and chairs which were covered with real flowers, and everyone was amazed at the possibility of finding so many real flowers in the middle of winter. And that's some of the interiors which are still alive, I would like to say, in this palace, because it's now privately owned and it's rented out for balls. All the school balls in Vienna take place here, and you can imagine it's not on a certain level, not very good for the artworks in there, but it's still quite well preserved. That's a wonderful room which reminds us of the Wedgwood room, which is now in the Albertina. They also had a sort of Wedgwood room, but it's painted silk. It's not porcelain inlaid, but painted silk. And this wonderful oven, there is another one. It's a pair. One is a real oven. The other one is made of wood, and it has a little door at the side. And that was very much the habit at the time. People could sit inside and listen to the important political decisions which were made in the room. And this particular room and the oven also features in the opera Rosenkavalier, which you may know. And this is another palace, the Princely Palace of the Liechtensteins in Herrengasse. It was demolished in the early 20th century. It was designed by Josef Hartmut, the princely architect at the time. And this is a photo of the early 20th century, of about 1910. And if you look at the facade, it's grand and very clear. And the reality, which is always the case in Vienna, it's in a very narrow street, and it doesn't come to the full effect. But still, everyone, all of the families which were very close to the court, built palaces like this, even in the narrowest streets of Vienna. And all there is left of the palace, which was, as I said, demolished in the early 20th century, are these wonderful girandoles, of which 8 were there, and 4 are now left in the princely collection. And 2 of these wall panels, which are also, again, this wonderful wood carving, gilded wood carving, which creates this great effect of raised gilding. And a watercolor by Rudolf von Alt of about 1835 shows us what splendor there must have been in this palace. And the interiors were created in around 1790, and you can see all these wonderful panels. And here, looking out to the winter garden with a peacock walking. And here I show you a piece of porcelain, also in the princely collection, which somewhat connects to the wall decoration. And this dashing couple is Prince Alois von Liechtenstein, Alois I, and his wife Caroline von Liechtenstein, painted by Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun as Iris, the goddess. It was absolutely the latest fashion, also to be portraited by the great portraitists of the time. And these two, as you will see later on, ordered a grand porcelain service, but they also ordered a new silver service, of which we don't know anything but this document, which came to an amount of more than 70,000 guilders, which was quite expensive at the time. And it was ordered to replace other services which were taken to the mint. They were melted down, as Wolfram already explained, to finance the wars of coalition and later the Napoleonic Wars. And they, all the noble families were ordered by the emperor to bring their silver to the mint. And what many of them did, they just took the opportunity and made a new service in the latest style. So it was a sacrifice, of course, to lose all the old silver, but in a way they took it as a chance to get something more fashionable, if they had enough money to afford it. And that's another family, the Esterhazy family. That's an ideal view of the Esterhazy Palace in Eisenstadt, which is still to be visited today. And it was also, designed by Charles Moreau, by the great architect, but these 2 wings, which were to house the princely collections, were never realized. It was, as you see today, it's just the central part which has been built. And this is the entrance hall, and I just show you this to show you the sober taste, the very clean taste of high neoclassicism at the time. And that's the stables. It almost looks like the revolutionary architecture in France. It's the stables, very functional but very balanced architecture. So they were really at the height of taste then, and this is the view of today from the column terrace out to the Leopoldinen Temple. And it's only just for 2 years that you have this view. It was all like a jungle, and thanks to the Esterhazy private foundation, the garden is now being taken back to its former beauty as an English-style landscape garden. And that's Leopoldine Esterhazy, born Princess of Liechtenstein, in a portrait by Antonio Canova, who was also a star portraitist and sculptor in Vienna at the time. And everyone had to have pieces by Canova. You see more of that. And the princes of Esterhazy were very involved with music, and this is a porcelain portrait of Joseph Haydn, whose music we will hear later on, and that's the Haydn Saal where all the concerts took place. And one interesting thing is in terms of table culture is that Joseph Haydn had such a grand role at the court of the Esterházys, that he was allowed to sit at dinner next to the prince, which was completely against all rules. But since it was not the imperial household, rules could be bent a little bit. But everyone was surprised about these honors that the musician was given. And this is Prince Alois of Esterházy, Anton Esterházy, with his wife and the coat of arms in silver. And Anton Esterházy became prince in 1790. He succeeded his father, Nikolaus I, who was a great art mentor. And Fürst Anton, the minute he got through the throne, he melted. He brought the service not to the mint, but to Ignaz Sebastian Würth, to the cousin of our Ignaz Josef Würth of the great silver service. So the cousin took about 800 kilos of silver from the old Rococo Esterházy service and made it into a neoclassical silver service, which has some features which remind us of the Sachsen Teschen Service, such as the dolphins and somehow some of the friezes which can be associated to the work of Piranesi, which was very popular as a pattern book at the time. But and also here is a Hagenauer Viennese design, which can be somehow related to it. But it's a huge service, and many pieces have survived, about 150 pieces if you count the cutlery as well. And it's not as refined as the service of Albert von Sachsen-Teschen, but nevertheless, it still survives, which is rare, and the Esterházys had the possibility of taking their services, their silver, to Hungary, which allowed them to escape the order of the Austrian emperor to bring their silver to the mint. So this was a very clever way of getting around it. Nevertheless, new silver was made of the old one, and this surviving service weighs in total 600 kilos. And what is wonderful about it, recently the Esterházy Foundation has discovered the invoice of Würth, and the wonderful thing is that it lists even the locks which were delivered for the boxes in which the service was kept, and it also shows you how involved the goldsmith was in maintaining the beauty of the silver, because he also delivered with it a flannel cloth to clean it and something called silver powder. It must have been some cleaning powder for the service, and it cost around 38,000 guilders at the time. So it's now on display at the Esterházy Palace, and I looked at it closely, and I looked at the Sachsen Teschen Service, and I can see differences in finesse, but nevertheless it's worth mentioning, I think. And should you ever go to Eisenstadt, the palace is now in very wonderful condition. They also have neoclassical furniture designed by Henrici, and it's a rich collection which has come to life again. Now, coming to dinner in these palaces, this is a wonderful book which I think the gentleman has discovered, who made the wonderful napkin designs. And Wolfram also used it in the catalogue, and it's in the Viennese National Library to be looked at. And it's the education about all aspects of setting tables and of offering food at table. And here you can see a poor partridge being taken apart, and you have to imagine that meat and, well, all the animals which were eaten were taken apart next to the table, on a separate table where you could also find the wine coolers and the glasses, and also the so-called tranchier dishes. And then there was the tranchier Fräulein, ladies or gentlemen also, who took the pieces apart, and here are very detailed instructions of how to do it gracefully. The service à la française, which was prevailed throughout the 18th century, meant that all the dishes of one course came on the table at the same time. And as you can see, here is a design which is in the back of this cookbook. You have the plates of the people who eat, and then in the center, this is a small version, of course, of all the big banquet tables, but it just shows you how it's done. It has to be symmetrical. And of course, if you have all the dishes, and there were dozens of different dishes at each course, if you have to put them at the table at the same time, you have to have a great variety of shapes and tureens and platters to serve. That's why these services have now shapes and tools which we don't know anymore today. This is second course, and the dessert course, which was always with a wonderful centerpiece. I'll show you more about this later on. And this is for a Lent day at the Viennese court. It was set like that. The sardou is somewhat Austrianized version of surtout. And you have all the dishes here around. And a Lent day didn't mean that one just had a piece of bread and water, but you had the regular amount of dishes, but without meat. So you had all these great fish dishes like the carp and fish soups. And as you can see, it's all laid out very carefully, the size of the dishes and the place where they should be. And people sat around the table, and they had to help themselves or ask someone else to help them. And if you sat at the one end, of course, it was hard to reach the dish you would have liked to eat on the other end, so you had to ask someone. And there are reports of the time where people say that the only conversation was about what and how to get the next dish. And also, if you look at the ladles, they're very long, sometimes half a meter or even longer, so you had to stretch out across the table to get something to eat. And it must have been quite entertaining. And the tablecloths, I mean, we saw these great designs of napkins. The tablecloths were also an important topic, and this is a list, an inventory of tablecloths of the Liechtenstein family, and just one page just to show you what it looked like. But at around 1790, the Liechtenstein family had about 38 very fine, huge tablecloths. And they, as you can see in this inventory, it states the designs of these tablecloths. Many of them were with flowers, but also with a phoenix, as you can see here, bouquets of flowers, and the toison. And that's a page of a mid-18th century, a book about folding napkins. And in this cookbook, or table setting instruction book, which I showed you earlier, there is one section in which the author complains about the lack of knowledge in the late 18th century about these folding techniques. And he says that it is a wonderful art, and every table should have it, but it's getting lost and it gets forgotten. And another cookbook of that period, printed in Vienna, states that the tablecloths and the napkins have to be very white, like snow white. Yeah, and that's the sugar bakery in Vienna. It means it's the sugar bakery deposit in the palace. And I show you a service which once belonged, probably it's said it once belonged, we still have to do some research on this. It's a dessert service which belonged to the Sachsen Teschen couple. And as Wolfram said before, porcelain was used at dessert and not for the main courses. So this would be the dessert service with the fruit baskets and everything. All you needed, the ice cream pails, and one of these cookbooks which I mentioned also state that the cutlery for the dessert was made with porcelain handles. And that's part of the Liechtenstein porcelain dessert service, which is still in the princely collection, which is from 1784. And that's another service, and I show you two plates which were sample plates from the manufactory, so people could order to their own taste. And forget-me-nots were the greatest fashion, but also volcanoes. In the course of the Enlightenment, the forget-me-nots were perhaps not dramatic enough. And here you can see a dessert table set with porcelain figures. It was very important to have table ornaments made of porcelain for the dessert, so no longer the tureens, but porcelain figures were set to a certain topic. And as I told you, Antonio Canova was a great sculptor at the time, and he was much admired by the Anton Grassi, by the model master of the manufactory, and Antonia Canova made this wonderful tomb for Marie Christine, which is now in the Augustinerkirche in Vienna, and he finished it in 1805, and it's a great model for all the Viennese sculptors. And here I show you some of the biscuit figures, which were meant to be centerpieces. So there were about 70 of those on a big table in all sizes and also vases, very much in the taste of the antiquity, of course, simulating white Carrara marble as used by Canova in his big sculptures. And this one shows you the change in taste. It's now less, it's still the antiquity which is admired, but no longer the heroes perhaps, but it's the sensitivity, the sensibility which now wants to be shown and wants to be lived. It's a way of freeing oneself, of course. And there's a dead bird, and it says, "My darling is gone," in the inscription. So this would be one of the centerpieces at dessert. And my last picture shows you, I went around Vienna and wanted to take some pictures for you of the palaces. And this is one, it's the Palais Pallavicini next to the Imperial Palace. And this is Joseph II. And, well, it's under scaffolding, under reconstruction and restoration, and it shows you where to go for dinner in Vienna nowadays. Thank you very much.